My father died on a Tuesday. By Friday, my sister-in-law was standing at his graveside with a cashier's check and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. $500,000, she said, holding the envelope out to me like she was offering a tip to a valet. Sign the papers, walk away from the estate, and this is yours. No lawyers, no drama, no mess. I was still wearing black. The dirt on my father's grave was still fresh. And my husband's sister was trying to buy me out of my own inheritance before the flowers had even wilted. I looked at the check. I looked at her. And then I did something that made her eyes light up with pure, undisguised victory. I took it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment I folded that envelope and slipped it into my coat pocket, I had already won. She just needed a few more weeks to figure that out herself. My name is Claire, and I need to back up a little. Because this story doesn't start at a graveside. It starts 4 years earlier, in a sunlit conference room in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, where I was closing the biggest real estate transaction of my career. I was 29 years old, a licensed real estate attorney specializing in estate and property law, and I had just helped a family successfully transfer a $14 million commercial portfolio without a single probate complication. My boss called it elegant. My client called it a miracle. I called it a Tuesday. That same week, I met my husband at a charity gala his firm sponsored. His name was Daniel. He was an architect, tall and quiet, in the way that reads as thoughtful rather than distant, at least at first. He laughed at my jokes. He remembered what I ordered on our second date. He looked at me like I was worth looking at. We got married 18 months later in a small ceremony in the South Carolina mountains. My father walked me down the aisle. He cried twice, once when he saw me in my dress, and once during my vows. He was that kind of man, the kind who felt things all the way through. Daniel's family was different. His mother, whom I'll call my mother-in-law, ran the family the way a CEO runs a failing company, with absolute authority, zero transparency, and a talent for making everyone around her feel like they were performing poorly. She had opinions about everything: where we should live, when we should have children, how I should dress for family dinners. She never said anything overtly cruel. She was too smart for that. Instead, she specialized in the kind of comment that lands like a compliment but stings like a slap. "You're so brave to wear your hair like that," or "Claire always does things her own way, doesn't she?" His sister, my sister-in-law, was different from her mother only in style, not in substance. Where my mother-in-law preferred the slow simmer, my sister-in-law liked the direct confrontation dressed up in legal language. She was a financial advisor, good at her job, better at protecting the family's money than she was at anything resembling warmth. Her name was Renee. She had my mother-in-law's eyes and her father's sharpness, and she had never once, in 4 years of holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners, called me anything other than Daniel's wife. Not Claire, not her sister-in-law, Daniel's wife. I noticed. I always noticed. But I chose my battles because Daniel asked me to, and because I loved him, and because I genuinely believed that patience was a form of strength. I was wrong about that last part, or at least, I was wrong about who deserved my patience. My father's name was Robert. He was 67, healthy by every measure that mattered, active, sharp, funny in the dry way that snuck up on you. He had built a modest but stable life. He owned the house I grew up in outright. He had a small investment portfolio, carefully tended over 30 years. And he owned a 49% stake in a regional logistics company called Hargrove and Associates, which he had co-founded with his college roommate back in 1991. The company wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. But it was solid. And over the past decade, as e-commerce reshaped every industry that touched it, Hargrove and Associates had quietly become something extraordinary. The most recent independent valuation, which I had helped my father obtain 6 months before he died, put his stake at just over $11 million. My father told no one about that valuation except me. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, and we talked for 2 hours, and by the end of it, he had decided to revise his estate documents. He wanted everything handled carefully, legally, and above all, quietly. He didn't want drama. He didn't want a fight. He just wanted to make sure that what he had built went where he intended. We hired an estate attorney I trusted. We updated his will, established a revocable living trust, and documented everything with the kind of precision that closes loopholes before they can become lawsuits. My father signed the final documents on a Wednesday in October. He died of a sudden cardiac event the following February. I was at work when Daniel called me. I remember exactly where I was standing by the window in my office, watching the harbor. I remember the way the light looked. I remember not being able to feel my hands. What happened next is something I want to be honest about, because this is not a story where everything is black and white. I was devastated. Grief is not something you can strategize your way through, no matter how many documents you've prepared or how clearly you understand what comes next. I cried for days. I sat in my father's house surrounded by his things, and I missed him in a way that had no bottom to it. But grief and alertness are not mutually exclusive. My father had raised me to pay attention, and even in the worst week of my life, I was paying attention. The first sign came 3 days after the funeral, when my mother-in-law asked Daniel, over dinner, whether my father had left a will. It was a casual question, framed as concern. Daniel said he wasn't sure. I said nothing. The second sign came 2 days after that, when Renee called Daniel, not me. Daniel, to ask whether I had figured out the estate situation yet. He relayed the question to me with a slight apology in his voice, like he already knew it wasn't quite right but couldn't name why. The third sign came the morning of the graveside conversation, when I arrived at the cemetery and noticed Renee's car already parked at the entrance. She hadn't come to pay her respects. She had come prepared. She waited until everyone else had left, until it was just the two of us standing in the cold February air beside my father's headstone. Then she opened her bag and took out the envelope. $500,000, she said. Sign the papers, walk away from the estate, and this is yours. The papers, as it turned out, were a quitclaim deed for my father's house, a release of any interest in his investment accounts, and a broadly worded general release that would have, if I were anyone other than an estate attorney who had personally drafted the documents she was trying to unravel, effectively signed away my interest in the trust entirely. It was not a generous offer. It was not even close to a generous offer. It was an insult dressed up in commas and zeros, handed to a grieving daughter over her father's fresh grave, by a woman who had decided that my bereavement made me vulnerable enough to exploit. And so I took the envelope, and I let Renee believe she had won, and I went home and I made a phone call. What I need to explain, what I should have understood much earlier than I did, is that Renee's offer didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of information. Someone had told her about my father's stake in Hargrove and Associates. Someone had told her it had value. Someone had suggested that if I could be moved out of the picture quickly, before probate was fully initiated, there might be a way to redirect that value. That someone was Daniel. I didn't know that yet, not for certain, on the day of the graveside conversation. I suspected it. I had been suspecting it for weeks, quietly, the way you suspect something you don't yet want to be true. But I had learned over 4 years in estate law that suspicion without evidence is just pain. Evidence is what you can use. So I called my attorney. I called the executor of my father's estate, who was his longtime accountant and my godfather, a man named Gerald who had known me since I was 7 years old. And I called the managing partner of Hargrove and Associates, who had been my father's best friend for 35 years and who, when I explained what had happened at the graveside, said 3 words in a very quiet voice: "Tell me everything." What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There were no courtroom confrontations. There was no screaming. There was instead paperwork, meticulous, irrefutable, layered paperwork, the kind that estate attorneys build and financial advisors cannot dismantle because the foundations were poured before the threat arrived. My father's trust transferred cleanly. His house, his investment accounts, and his 49% stake in Hargrove and Associates all passed to me exactly as he had intended, without a single complication, because there was nothing to complicate. Every document was signed, every transfer was recorded, every line had been drawn in the right place at the right time. The quitclaim deed Renee had asked me to sign was unenforceable. She had based her entire strategy on the assumption that my father had died intestate, or at the very least that his estate was unprotected and accessible. She had been wrong on every point. The cashier's check sat in my attorney's safe while we waited to see whether Renee would escalate. She did. She hired her own attorney, who sent a letter suggesting that the trust documents might be challenged on the grounds that my father lacked testamentary capacity when he signed them. Gerald had anticipated this. We had anticipated this. My father's physician had provided a written assessment of his cognitive status at the time of signing. His attorney had recorded the session. There was nothing to challenge, and Renee's attorney knew it, and within 10 days the letter was followed by silence. It was during those 6 weeks that I learned the full shape of what Daniel had done. He had told Renee about my father's stake in the company. He had told her about the valuation. He had suggested, not ordered, not demanded, but suggested, in the careful way of someone who wants results without fingerprints, that if Renee could approach me at a moment of emotional vulnerability, the offer might work. He had framed it as protecting the family's financial interests. He had framed it as something my father would have understood. He had been wrong about my father in every possible way. I found this out not from Daniel, who never volunteered any of it, but from Renee herself, who in a conversation I had with her 3 weeks after the graveside, said something that she clearly believed was a justification, but that functioned, instead, as a confession. She said Daniel had told her I was overwhelmed and not thinking clearly. She said he had suggested the timing. She said she had only been trying to help the family. She said this to me, the estate attorney, whose father had just died, whose husband had apparently decided that her grief was a strategic opening. I sat across from her in a coffee shop, 2 blocks from my office, and I listened to everything she said, and I did not change my expression once. Here is what I want to say about Daniel, because he deserves more than to be a villain in 2 sentences. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been raised by people who believed that financial resources were the primary measure of family loyalty, and who had learned to protect those resources the way other families protect secrets. He loved me, I think, in the way that he was capable of loving, which was genuinely, but not unconditionally, and not when the conditions became inconvenient. What he had done was a betrayal, not a dramatic, shouting, throwing things betrayal, but the quieter kind. The kind where someone who knows your vulnerabilities decides to use them and tells themselves they had reasons, and maybe even believes it. I filed for divorce 4 months after my father died. Daniel did not fight it. I think part of him had known, since the morning after the graveside conversation when I came home and said almost nothing about what had happened, that something had shifted permanently. People who understand leverage know when they've lost it. We divided what was ours to divide. There was no drama about the house, because the house was mine before we married, and had remained in my name. There was no drama about the estate, because the estate was already settled. There was, mostly, just the long quiet of dismantling a life that had been built on a foundation that turned out to be softer than it looked. Renee tried to call me once, after the divorce was finalized. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that I listened to exactly once, and then deleted. She said she hoped we could move past it. She said family was important. She said she was sorry if things had been misunderstood. I am a very precise person. I do not misunderstand documents. I do not misunderstand cashier's checks. I do not misunderstand the timing of an offer made over a fresh grave. But I did not call her back to say any of that. I had nothing left to prove to Renee, and proving things to people who will not hear them is one of the most expensive ways to spend your energy. I had learned that from my father, who had spent 35 years building something real while other people argued about credit. What happened to the stake in Hargrove and Associates is not the point of this story, but I'll tell you anyway, because I think my father would have liked you to know. The company was acquired 14 months after his death by a larger logistics firm out of Atlanta. My 49% stake closed at just under $13 million, because the business had continued to grow in the months since his valuation. Gerald cried when we got the final number. I think I smiled for about 3 days straight. I bought a house on the South Carolina coast, small and quiet, with a porch that faces the water and a yard big enough for a garden. I planted tomatoes and dahlias, and a climbing rose along the back fence, because my father always said a garden tells you what kind of person someone is, and I wanted to be the kind of person who tends things carefully and watches them grow. I still practice law. I still help families protect what they've built, still sit across from people in the hardest moments of their lives and help them make sure that what their loved ones intended is what actually happens. I am good at this work, and I am grateful for it, and it means something different to me now than it did before. I think about my father often. I think about that Sunday phone call, and the way he paused before he asked me whether I thought the estate documents were solid. I said yes, and I meant it, and I was right. He died knowing that what he had built would go where he intended. That's not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. There is one more thing I want to say. For anyone listening who is sitting in their own version of that graveside moment, who has been handed an envelope by someone who believes your grief makes you manageable, who has been told that walking away is the sensible choice, who has been underestimated in the worst possible timing. Take a breath. Say nothing you don't mean. And remember that the people who mistake your silence for surrender have already made their biggest mistake. My father used to say that the strongest position is the one you've already prepared. He spent 30 years building that position. He spent that Sunday afternoon making sure I knew where everything was. I never told him how much that phone call would mean. I wish I had, but I hope he knew. The check Renee gave me, by the way, was returned to her in full, uncashed, certified mail, with a brief letter from my attorney explaining that the underlying documents were unenforceable and that no further contact regarding the estate would be necessary. I don't know what she did with it. I don't particularly need to. Some things you hold on to because they matter, and some things you let go of because you've already gotten everything you came for.